I'm Heather Tedesco, and I'm really happy to be back and to see so many of you coming. I feel like I might bring some bad weather with me. When I came last year, it was you had some bad storms, and then I got snowed out in January, but I'm back even with the rain, and am really appreciative that you have come out tonight, and look forward to sharing with you some information that I think is so important for parents today. I am a psychologist. I have a practice working with parents. I'm also a parent. I have 3 children, one in elementary school, one in middle school, and one in high school. So I feel like I'm living and breathing it at every level, and am not doing it all perfectly for sure, but I am passionate about the things that we can do as parents and the impact that we can have on our kids. So I'm going to just start off giving you a little bit of a grounding in how I see parenting. I see it as tough. It is very stressful to be a parent today. There's a lot of pressure on us, and none of us is perfect. There are, sort of no right answers much of the time to begin with, and it's a challenge on a day-to-day basis. Part of why it's such a challenge is our kids keep changing. So, I hear from parents all the time that they feel pretty comfortable, and all of a sudden it's like the wheels fell off. And, it's because kids move through many different developmental stages, and we as parents need to adjust along with them, and it's very hard to do. Another thing that's really tough is that there is no lack of information out there for us as parents, for sure, way too much of it probably, and a lot of it contradicts itself. And so even if you're trying to be an informed parent and seeking out information, it's sometimes impossible to tell sort of what's the quote-unquote good advice from the bad advice. And then with kids, no, it's not one size fits all anyway. And so a lot of sort of the old conventional wisdom, particularly where anxiety is concerned, a lot of the quote-unquote normal parenting behaviors are not productive when we're talking about kids with anxiety. I'm a big believer that the long view helps, and that if we as parents try to stay grounded in kind of what's our big picture that we're trying to accomplish, what do we really value and care about for our kids, that can take some of the pressure off. And I am also a huge believer that there is a lot of good information out there. It's just in a lot of academic journals and in ways that aren't so easy for us to consume as parents. So I think there's a lot of good information that can guide us that I'd like to share. Here's one piece of good information. It is the only sort of theory I'm going to present to you tonight, I promise. It's self-determination theory, but I really see this as the most valuable little nugget for parents to kind of have in their back pocket throughout all of those developmental stages, which is what keeps kids kind of motivated and happy. It's true for all of us as human beings, actually, but kids don't disguise why they're doing what they're doing nearly as well as we adults can. So essentially, they're seeking to be competent, learning new skills. Competence leads to confidence, which leads to self-esteem. That's the path there, and so you'll hear me mention that again tonight. I'm going to talk a lot about connection and how important that is. That's sort of the source of our influence as parents, and it's also, frankly, the source of our joy, I think, as parents. And then the need for autonomy is, a good thing, particularly where anxiety and stress are concerned, because we want kids to want to be in control of themselves and to feel capable. So these sort of 3 things are good to know because, again, a lot of the techniques for helping support kids when they're struggling are directly related to one or more of those. Okay, so tonight we're here to look sort of at stress, kind of at a lower level, and at anxiety up to a clinical level. And these statistics, it's a lot of information to digest. The key points, I think, are just how high the prevalence is of these mental disorders. 1 in 3, almost 1 in 3 adolescents will qualify as having an anxiety disorder by the end of high school. 22% of adolescent girls in middle-class homes. And it's not necessarily the kids you would expect to struggle who are struggling the most. And there's a lot of nuance underneath these statistics. I only raise them because we're here talking about it. I just want to make sure that if you're a parent whose child is struggling, that first of all, you are not alone. There are a lot of families struggling with these concerns right now. Okay, so why are these statistics so high? I'm going to give you, kind of my own theorizing, I guess you would say, but based in a lot of research and experience on what factors might be increasing stress on our kids. One of them, for sure, is, the rigorous course, the academic expectations, the fact that they can do a year's worth of college in high school or more sometimes. The fact that kindergartners are being expected to do, sort of actual things that were in first or second grade years ago. It's sort of up and down the chain. They're being tested a lot, not at your teacher's discretion much of the time. And then when you get outside of school, the things that used to be kind of relaxing and, kind of just fun extracurriculars often have kind of become, in a sense, professionalized, where, it's not enough to be on a team. You might need to be on a travel team, or you might need to have multiple practices and, skill development workshops. Or if you're playing an instrument or something, you may be having, multiple levels of competitions and organizations that you belong to. They can be wonderful and very beneficial, but they're time consuming, and time pressure is one of the biggest sources of stress. We as a culture have really switched the focus from many generations ago, where it was more about effort, and now it's sort of all about achievement. Everything is measured and quantified, and we have all of these great data analytics. But it's also, everything is sort of public knowledge. Kids are sharing with each other very readily how they're doing, comparing against one another constantly. We as adults are being given lots of things to benchmark our kids and compare them. And, it just all together sends this message of achievement, when the research shows that, sort of the focus on the outcome rather than the process is, not only limiting to performance much of the time, but definitely more stress-inducing. Okay, and then we have technology. Technology does many wonderful things, but there is it's continuing to come out, new research showing the challenges of sort of this online social connectivity and awareness, particularly as linked to anxiety and depression. And so, there is something happening from kids not being able to ever, quote unquote, turn off. The kind of downtime where you used to be able to go home after a rotten day and just sort of, hide out and relax with your family, or, go in your room and kind of shut out the world. It just isn't available in the same way to kids. And, that can be really difficult. And then, you get the technology itself, which much of it is sort of intentionally designed to be highly addictive and difficult to stop. And, when kids are stressed out, it becomes a wonderful avoidance technique from the things that are bothering them, and then that perpetuates the problem. It is an enormous challenge, and I think, time is only going to increase our understanding of how big this challenge is. What gets squeezed out when we have all of these other things taking up so much of our time and energy, and our kids' time and energy? What gets squeezed out is what psychologists would probably call the good stuff, the things that we are built to want and to feel better when we have. Face-to-face social interaction. Yes, online interaction is a form of social connection, and yet we are built for face-to-face. We read body language. We have special ways to process that, and it grounds us differently than the online. And so it is, when it is lacking, it is a loss for our kids. And then downtime is so crucial to allowing kids the space to process their emotions and their stress, and allowing them to sort of figure themselves out. And so, it's very difficult to protect sort of time doing nothing. It's easy to get it crowded out by time doing something. And so, downtime is super challenging for today's kids. And then there's us. We mean so well. I am a firm believer, especially all of you who have come here to listen to me tonight. We as parents are incredibly committed. Older generations of parents sometimes shake their head and say, gosh, I can't imagine sort of putting that much time and energy into parenting. Always fun when your own parents say that, right? But it is true that there are ways that we as parents can be enormously supportive and helpful. And then there are ways that we as parents can inadvertently make things harder, or interfere in ways that aren't productive. And so it's a challenge. All right. You know, I'm not positive that universities actually are more selective, but for sure they are soliciting more applications so that their yield rates look more selective. And for sure our kids are absorbing the message that colleges are more selective. And so this is a big source of stress for many, many kids. We always are existing in a broader climate that right now I think is also one of a lot of uncertainty that can create stress. And you know, we also, I have to say, since I got snowed out in January till now, you know, there's been a horrible tragedy at a school that has added a lot of stress and, you know, genuine anxiety for some children and families. So, you know, there's also, you know, kind of a zeitgeist that we're parenting in. The one positive I really do want to highlight is some of that, you know, some of the increase in the incidence of anxiety, depression, et cetera, is good in that we are getting much more willing to identify and to get treatment for these things, which is fabulous because there is good treatment out there for anxiety, depression, and other mental health concerns. And so we can, you know, kids can get better, adults can get treatment. And I want to highlight that because it's not always bad when numbers rise if it means that more people are becoming aware and seeking help. All right, so here's where I love to spend my time, is not sort of the, oh, why is this, it's so horrible, but what can we do? Because, you know, we can't always fix everything, but we certainly can have a big impact in a lot of areas. So this is what I'm focusing the rest of tonight on. I got a lot of ideas. We're going to talk first about the first few in red, because those are what I'm going to kind of label sort of the clinical anxiety coaching pieces, if you will. And then the second set are a little bit more sort of stress, more generally, anxiety, maybe at a lower level, you know, that apply sort of regardless of whether there's more severe clinical issues. Okay, so what is, you know, kind of stress and anxiety at a very basic physiological level? It is energy. It is the activation of our body's safety and survival instinct. And so it is incredibly grounded in our physical body. And, you know, it hasn't really evolved very much, frankly, from when we used to need to run away once in a while from life-threatening situations. And so this is sort of the list of things that happens within the body. If you think about it, you know, it is really well designed for running away from danger. One of the most notable things that happens from sort of a psychologist's perspective is that the part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that does all of the thinking, the rational thinking, the sort of complex thought, the judgment, the decision making, the weighing of options, pros and cons, it goes dark. It basically turns off. Which is good if you're, you know, if you've got a bear chasing you. It's really not helpful from a survival perspective to stop and, you know, assess. How big is the bear? How fast is he running? Which direction should he go, you know, is he going? Should I go that direction or this direction? Maybe I should climb a tree. I don't know. You're eaten, right? So, you know, and the other parts of this also have to do with mobilizing our body for action. That's great when we're trying to flee a bear. It's not so helpful that this is the same thing that happens when kids are nervous about a test or about a social situation or, you know, some other kind of chronic day-to-day concern. And indeed, there are things that go wrong when we're under that fight or flight response frequently on a chronic basis, because we are not built to be under that sort of daily fight or flight response. So one of the things that's very important, I think, to understand is that chronic stress isn't just unpleasant, and it doesn't just sort of interfere with functioning in the moment, but in our adolescents and teenagers who are in a really unique and pivotal part of their brain formation, it can actually shape the way that the brain wires. And, you know, that's not, we want them to be experiencing, you know, all of the healthy, positive things that they can during this really pivotal point. You know, there is sort of no magic answer for most of these complex problems, but when, you know, kind of like drinking water is usually a good thing to do. When in doubt, more sleep is often a good thing to do, because if we get enough rest, that helps us regulate our emotions, that helps us think more clearly, you know, it does all kinds of wonderful things for our minds and our bodies. So one of the things we know is that chronic sleep deprivation, which is the norm for many of our kids, particularly when we're stressed. It's very difficult to get a good night's rest, and yet that interferes with the whole process of managing it. We as adults, I think, have an obligation to make sure that we are sending appropriate messages to our youth about stress, because the wider world very much is sending kind of this idea that more is better, and stress is good, and have another energy drink, and let's put caffeine into all of these different products that are not meant to be caffeinated, and let's just kind of power through it. There's sort of a little bit of a badge of honor sometimes in that. And yet we know that's not good. That's not going to lead to good performance. That's not going to lead to good emotions. And so I think we need to also balance that message for our youth and let them know that, it's not a sign of strength. A sign of strength is being able to, kind of balance yourself and to prioritize your well-being as well as your kind of productivity. Here's another important one for us as parents, because many of us as parents have a lot of stress and anxiety around our kids. Of course we do. We love them. That's, kind of part of the package. But emotions are contagious. And not only can we sort of catch their stress when they're under sort of these, conditions of high stress, but if we are very stressed, either ourselves or on their behalf, that feeds back to them too, and it can spiral up together. And so we as adults really do need to practice some of what we might preach in terms of how to keep our own stress and under control. All right, and then you're here tonight, so you can check this off the box, but I think it is really important for adults to be active in communicating to our kids about stress management, about anxiety, helping them to recognize it, and to, in particular, learn good ways to cope with it. Because anxiety is part of being a human being. It's not like we're trying to eradicate it. We're just trying to learn how to manage it. Okay, so just a very quick slide about the brain, about the teenage brain in particular, because again, it's very relevant to why they're experiencing some of what they're experiencing. So, I mentioned the prefrontal cortex. That's the part on the left-hand side. It's kind of our forehead part. This is, again, our higher ordered thinking, our reasoning, our rational thought, our, kind of judgment, our planning. You've probably heard something about it. It is not going to be fully developed in your kids until they're somewhere in their probably mid to late 20s. It is definitely not going to be fully developed here in these, K through 12 school years. And as we are adults, so many of us live so happily kind of in the land of the prefrontal cortex. And we have very logical, rational discussions and back and forths and, sometimes long debates and things. And we try to, kind of present to our kids the same way and communicate to them the same way. And it doesn't work. They're just not, that's not where they're at. Kids are in this, kind of much more in this sort of limbic system area. And in particular, that's sort of all the colorful stuff in the middle there. And that's the emotional regulation. And, it is the part that comes online first. And sort of by definition, that makes kids more emotional and less rational than adults. There's some really sort of cool things that go with that. The capacity to learn is at its peak in these teenage years. They are very sort of experiential learners, and they're really equipped as their brains are shaping to catch things quickly and lock it in. Again, what they're doing right now is what's going to be sort of disproportionately represented in their brains, and so we want them to be engaging in healthy behaviors if possible. Addiction is a form of learning, and so unfortunately, they are also vulnerable. I hear it all the time. We used to think of addiction more with substance abuse, but with technology, it's become very relevant as well. So, it's just useful for us to understand as adults that, our kids are at a different place. They're in a very exciting place, the sort of lots of emotions, kind of swinging up and down without sort of the balance and the brakes, if you will, from the prefrontal cortex. It's truly a very energizing and exciting and creative point in life. Okay, so what does stress and anxiety look like? Again, every person has stress and some anxiety. We're interested more in whether it is impairing function in getting in the way. So when there is sort of frequent stress, it can look like these things. Stomach aches and headaches are, I think, the most common presentation in kids. especially younger kids. I just had somebody who worked in a clinic mention the huge uptick in very young kids coming into the clinic complaining of, sort of these various physical symptoms. So that's a big one. The procrastination is an interesting one because I often have parents come to me very frustrated that they just think their child is not motivated. And, it's not that that's never the case, but more often than not, when we dig a little bit, the child's very stressed, and when you're anxious, it can freeze you. It can be paralyzing. And, it can kind of lead to avoidance. It can lead to kind of shutting down. And that looks like, kind of lack of motivation when that's not sort of the root cause, if you will. The irritability is another huge one. Kids can throw tantrums at any age, right? We adults can throw them too. We call them hissy fits usually when we get older. But, it is a natural outpouring of the physical energy that comes with that fight or flight response, that comes with the anxious response in our bodies. We need to expel that energy. And if we don't have sort of good positive coping mechanisms, sometimes we just lash out. And, that's sort of a quick hit that gets it out, can turn off the response, but obviously has a cost to it. And then we also have things, the memory and focus is for students incredibly challenging, but that is one thing that stress can do. And sleeping issues are always, kind of high on the list when kids are struggling. Social withdrawal is another one. Sometimes if we're trying to figure out if kids might be sort of beyond normal mood swings and getting into depression and things, we look for things like that. Are there changes? Are there withdrawals? And then, it can move into some more, kind of concrete mental health types of concerns here. Okay, so again, thinking sort of clinically in terms of anxiety that is interfering with functioning. It is really hard to parent an anxious child because many of the exact same responses that are considered appropriate and positive when it is not anxiety at the heart of a child's behavior are the exact wrong things to do when anxiety is what's sort of driving the bus. And it's confusing to everybody. And, it's really important if you think your child is anxious that, you kind of think about how you're responding in the face of it, because what your defaults are that, again, are really appropriate when it's not anxiety become difficult when it is. So one of the things we need to know is, again, that fight or flight response that comes when we worry and when anxiety is present feels terrible. Okay, it does not feel good, even though it's energy, it's, a whole bunch of things happening in our body that doesn't feel good. It is really aversive. Kids are not consciously thinking through, that makes me anxious and I don't want to do it. They're operating on a much more sort of subliminal level where they just want to not feel that way. And so they're kind of pre-programmed to, do things that prevent them from being in that state of anxiety. It is really motivating, usually more motivating even than sort of the conscious intention to overcome it. So it's very strong and powerful. And yet, if we as parents, anytime sort of our kids are able to be successful at avoiding whatever things make them anxious, if they're able to, kind of get assistance to, kind of push the anxiety to the side, that actually strengthens the anxiety and increases it over time. It doesn't just magically go away. And that sort of spiral is what a lot of people get trapped in. So what to do? There are some very predictable responses that kids who feel anxious want from us as parents. So one of them is they want our help, but they want our help to not have to do whatever makes them feel anxious. I mean, that's reasonable, right? If a child has social anxiety, it is really distressing for them to think about going to a party. Or if they have, school anxiety, there's a lot of school refusal because the idea of going to school is, sometimes incredibly difficult for kids. And the last thing they want to do is go to school. And they've got this actual physical response in their body telling them, kind of freeze, don't go, don't, kind of go through it. And so when we know that it is anxiety that is leading a child to want to opt out of something, we as parents want to try not to give in to that. It's not always possible, and it's certainly not appropriate a lot of the time to just sort of, kick them to the curb and say, go to school, here you are. There are steps that have to be taken. There's support that needs to be given. But it is important to sort of look for whether, they're sort of, again, often very, kind of on an unconscious level, trying to get us to help them avoid. Another thing that kids look to parents for very frequently is reassurance. We call these checking behaviors a lot in therapy. So if a child asks the same question over and over again, a whole bunch of different ways, just, over, and you're like, do they not remember? Why are they doing that? The act of asking a question can transfer some of the sort of ownership of it in a weird way for kids and make them feel a little bit comforted. It's when you're answering the same question over and over again, when you are reassuring a child's anxiety, you're not actually speaking to your child, you're speaking to the child's anxiety, and that strengthens that anxiety. So we don't want to do that. It is really difficult, though. It's something that we usually get sucked into before we know it's happening. And one of the things I'll say in a minute about anxiety is that it has to do with uncertainty. And so often kids will ask us a bunch of things to try to make something that isn't certain for them. And life is full of uncertainty. And so again, it's okay to answer some questions, but if it feels to you to be sort of too much, then that's telling you something. Because again, we need to, instead of trying to take away all of the uncertainty, we really need to help equip our kids to manage the uncertainty that exists. So that reassurance one is a really big piece. And then, there are times when anxiety is just too much and it just sort of floods a child and they just sort of shut down. Yes, I mean, for sure, don't let your child suffer. That's a sign that, okay, that particular situation might have been too powerful. You might need some help, or you might need to step back and, kind of do something that's a little bit less threatening. But, kids do often look to us to rescue them if they really become uncomfortable and distressed. So what can we do instead if that's not good? I'm just going to overview very briefly a couple of communications things that can work better. It takes some practice, quite frankly. But one of the things we want to do is use our observation skills. We don't want to layer in judgment. We don't want to say, I think you're anxious. That's not really helpful to an anxious person to hear, believe it or not. Better to be a mirror of their behavior and say, I see that I can tell by the way you have thrown your backpack down and slammed your math book, not that they have math books anymore, but slammed your notebook down, that you seem to be really frustrated right now. Am I right? You try to empathize with how they're feeling. Validating their feelings and their point of view is crucial for them to be able to hear you. And it doesn't mean that you're validating their behavior. Parents can get tripped up sometimes and think, if a child's done something outlandish and you try to empathize a little bit, that you're somehow condoning it. That it's not that. You're just trying to, how they feel is real and important, and you're just trying to empathize and validate that. And then when you want to sort of move into problem solving, you want to make sure that you're doing it collaboratively, okay? We all are good problem solvers as adults, right? That's the benefit of a fully formed prefrontal cortex and, many years of experience. But we can't just give our kids the answers. Number one, because, we have great answers, but sometimes they have better ones. And number two, because we would like them to become independent problem solvers. We want to equip them to learn how to do that for themselves. And if we're just feeding them our best answers, they're not getting the practice and the skill building that they need. Much better to use questions and kind of talk them through. So I'll come to that in a minute here. A few more things about anxiety, though, is that there are 3 questions that parents can use, maybe not in the true heat of the moment when that limbic system is full tilt and there's not a lot of rational thought, but when your child is sort of willing and able to engage in a little bit of conversation, you want to try maybe some of these questions together. Therapists will often use these questions. One of them is, so an anxious brain makes very predictable thinking errors. One of them is catastrophizing, meaning that an anxious brain assumes the worst is going to happen. And so you can ask that question. And often you need to ask it a couple of times, because the first time only kind of cuts to the surface level. And really there's usually a core fear at the root of it that you might need to layer down a couple of times through. But you want to see if you can kind of try to get some words around what that core fear really is, and what they're really afraid could happen. Then you want to ask them how likely it is to happen. An anxious brain is going to way overestimate the likelihood of a negative result. Sometimes there is no hard evidence. If it's a fear of flying or something that we have statistics on, then there are sometimes ways to counteract it with data. But most of the time, it's actually not something that there's data. Sometimes it is something that you have evidence for. Maybe they're afraid that they're going to have no one to sit with at lunch. And you can ask, well, did you have anyone to sit with yesterday or last week or last month? Sometimes you can, kind of prompt them to, reevaluate a little bit what that likelihood is. But frankly, it's okay if they're going to be stuck in the worst possible outcome and an incredibly high likelihood of it. Because the third question is really the crux of it, and you want to make sure you get to the third one, which is, can you handle it? Because at its most basic level, the remedy for anxiety is what we call efficacy as psychologists, meaning feeling some sense of control and some ability to act in the face of fear, if you will. And so usually with kids, the sort of default assumption is whatever is frightening is out there somewhere. It's too difficult to name. You can't really quite see it. They don't want to think about it deeply enough to be able to fully put words around what it even is. They just know there's something horrible out there that's really likely to happen. So they need to sort of stop and recognize that the very vast majority of the time, even though it would be very uncomfortable, very difficult, unpleasant, that they could survive it, they could handle it, and that can begin to chip away at it. So, remember the watches are there because anxiety is about the future. It's about the what if, it's about the unknown, okay? It's about fear of what might happen. And so if we can ground them in the present, that's shown to be a very valuable technique. Mindfulness, 5 senses, say something you can see, something you can smell, something you can hear. Those types of questions. But remember that you need to make sure that you're not trying to take away all of the uncertainty for your kids, because that's actually not really preparing them to, kind of face the wider world. We need to allow them to tolerate some uncertainty. All right, one more thing kind of on the clinical piece before I get to the broader stress. It's really important in terms of allowing kids to feel this sense of control over anxiety, that we don't make their anxiety equal to them. They are not their anxiety. They are not anxious. They are feeling anxious. It is a feeling. They have a choice whether to act on that feeling or not. And so the more we can, kind of help them recognize that it is one voice in their ear that they can decide whether or not to listen to by evaluating it kind of logically with our help, perhaps, that can really help. Because again, we're not trying to get rid of anxiety. Anxiety itself is not problematic. It's our reactions to anxiety that are problematic. So one of the big things that we can do as parents is normalize it. It's not, don't be afraid to feel anxious, you can tell your child. It's okay. And, it's really helpful if you can give them examples from your own life or from other people who have had situations where they've been very anxious and yet managed to do it. Whether it's something big at work or whether you, played a sport or performed in some way or whatever it may be, share those. False alarms is a big one, and when I was here earlier today speaking to faculty and staff, and we actually had a real alarm, and for about 20 minutes had the pleasure of a true fire alarm, which was kind of funny, given that the analogy of a fire alarm is one that's incredibly useful to use with anxious kids. So the idea of a fire alarm is that it goes off when there's a fire, hopefully. But that is not the only reason it goes off. And earlier today, there was no fire in the building. In fact, somebody had pulled the fire alarm. And so when you're talking to your kids, you might talk about the smoke detector in your house. If they're young, if they're older, you can talk about any kind you want. But you want to draw the analogy that, when the smoke detector goes off in your house, you do not immediately go running, screaming out of your house to your neighbors and call 911, the second you hear it, right? That's not how we respond. We're supposed to take that as a cue to look around, observe, assess, determine what the cause is. If we think there is a real danger, we should respond accordingly. If we think it's a false alarm, or if it's like we burned our toast or some other reason where maybe there is actual smoke, but it's still not a reason to flee the house, we need to use our judgment to override sort of that initial impulse to follow that energy fight or flight response. That is a really helpful way, I think, to kind of conceptualize anxiety, because anxiety, again, it gives us the need to act. It fills our body with that negative aversive state of energy. So again, if you feel your child has too much anxiety, help them tune into what their body is doing, what that reaction is, what their emotions feel like. Awareness is an important step. And then you focus on, all of the things they can do. We focus on strengths when kids are struggling, actually. We spend some time on the weaknesses and on the areas they need support, but we actually need to put more time into the areas that they're strong, help them feel empowered and efficacious. We need to focus on connection, which I'll talk about too, and again, autonomy, their ability. How do we do that? The age-old parenting mantra, freedom within limits. If your child is anxious, you have to be pretty good about those limits. Anxious kids push those limits a lot, but they really need them. It's actually very anxiety-provoking for them not to have sort of known and trustworthy limits on certain things. So you want to make sure that you're kind of helping your child learn some good ways to respond. So let's talk a little bit about coping methods. As I said, the body is not built to be under chronic stress over and over again for long periods of time. So we do have kind of some default ways. They're not very good for us, though. Our defaults to handle strong emotions are to either avoid it, to kind of act out, to rely on other people, or other kinds of, frankly, avoidance coping methods. Much, much better to develop positive ways to do it. And this is something you can actively build in your kids. This is a small, incomplete list, but there are a couple of key ones. The breathing is the number one, because when you look at that list of fight or flight response, things that happen in the body, there is only one thing on that list that we have conscious control over, and that is our breathing. And we cannot have slow and controlled breathing and that fight or flight response happening at the same time. They're incompatible. And so it is really useful to help your child learn and to practice. The practice is key. How to do some slow regulated breathing, matching the in-breath to the out-breath for a count of at least 5 each, ideally about 7 each. Doing that 2 or 3 times, very slow and carefully, can turn and reverse that fight or flight process and kind of bring back online our reasoning and thinking ability. And we have to practice it because, again, when we are in that kind of fight or flight, we can't think through the catalog of good ideas and pick one. It has to be a habit in order to kind of bypass that whole decision-making process. We have to have practiced it when we're calm in order to do it when we're anxious. And the other things on here, I mentioned, grounding in the present moment is incredibly useful to preventing the brain from sort of spiraling ahead. And then, there's all kinds of other things that are very, kind of specific to individuals. We are hardwired to feel calmer outdoors than indoors is, one to think about. But I would work with your children and with yourself to figure out what things work for you and help them to connect these behaviors to how they feel. Okay, the research shows very clearly that the more positive methods of calming down that we have, the fewer of those negative risky behaviors that we engage in. So there's good reason to work on it. Okay, so the rest of the time I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about things that we can do for sort of, anxiety and stress in general rather than sort of clinically. All right, so I mentioned connection several times, and this is crucial. You know, it's the source of our influence as parents. It's kind of the strength of our connection, but much more importantly, it's really the source of our joy as parents. You know, that strong connection, and you know, we can build it and strengthen it kind of continually. Kids really need that. The research on resilience shows how important it is for kids to feel unconditionally loved and accepted by one or more adults. And in particular, they really need to feel seen as they are. And so when a child is vulnerable or struggling in some way, as they may be if they're anxious, it's particularly important for them to feel sort of seen and loved and accepted, you know, even when they're not feeling at their best. And so we can provide that as parents. For sure, you feel it. It's just a matter sometimes of being really explicit over it. Again, the communication techniques of asking those questions well and making sure we listen to the answers. A little more on that communication. I always say channel your inner Jeopardy contestant, because you're going to want to use open-ended, you know, phrase things as a question. So what do we do in a nutshell, you know, kind of the brief overview of good communication that you can use any age, any stage, quite frankly. We want to make sure that we are not judging, we are simply, you know, stating what we see. We want to make sure that we're asking questions, because our kids are the experts on themselves. We want to let them develop that capacity to introspect and to share. We want to use a lot of empathy. Again, that's sort of what helps them feel seen and known, helps them feel connected. And remember, you know, they're not able to sit and process long, you know, kind of soliloquies that we may want to give the way that we can with other adults. They're very much grounded in emotion, and the language of emotion is empathy. So it's very important to use that. When we get to the sort of what are we going to do, problem-solving part of it, again, don't let your, you know, kind of doer take over. Make sure that we're working to build those skills in them and let them become the good problem solver. Again, we want to do a lot as parents, right? We have a lot of energy and motivation and passion on our kids' behalf. It's wonderful, but we just need to make sure that we're channeling it appropriately. We want to channel it often into like taking over, right? Because we can and we're really good at it. And our kids sometimes need help. But it's better actually from our kids' point of view if the doing is listening very actively. They want to feel heard, you know, and they need to kind of have someone to bounce ideas off, and their ideas change. And we can get frozen in time a lot of as parents. All right, so other things, building resilience. You know, when we think about having, you know, kind of more stress than is desirable, one of the solutions is to try to take away things that are stressful, right? And that's worth thinking about for sure. What are the things that I could eliminate that are causing stress, that are optional? Excellent. But the reality is that not everything is optional, and some things that cause stress can't be eliminated. There's another side to that equation, though. We can actually build the capacity to handle stress. That is essentially what resilience is. It is the ability to cope with challenges. Again, when we as parents do too much for our kids, it weakens their ability and confidence to do for themselves. And so sometimes, you know, if we just step too far across that line from being very attentive parents into maybe over-parenting a little bit, you know, we want to be cognizant of that and walk it back sometimes. Okay, so how do we build resilience? One of the key things is we have got to send good messages about failure. Once again, our society is not helping us right now with this. There was a time when failure, you know, like the ability to sort of fail and then succeed was really heralded and celebrated, but it's not right now. You know, now it's sort of all about making it look easy, that you got it the first time, you know, and you know, that you can do all of these things without really even putting much effort in. People try to sometimes hide the effort behind the scenes. And that is a difficult message for kids to get because they aren't yet experienced enough to realize that it's sort of a false front. And so we want to make sure that we're communicating that failure is it's necessary for growth. It's desirable when we can use it to learn, that it's part of challenge. These are messages teachers try to send all the time. And, you know, again, we as parents can just amplify and continue those conversations. Many of us as parents have, kind of perfectionism, fear of failure, specifically around our parenting as well as other things. Our kids pick up on that. They can feel that. And, we don't do our best work when we're coming from a place of fear, regardless of what we're doing. And so we really need to think about how we're, kind of managing fear and how we're allowing failure. It's horrible to let your child fail, especially when you can see it, kind of setting up and likely to happen. But it only gets harder as they get older. And so, whatever age and stage your child is at, you want to make sure while they're living with you that they're developing the ability to fail as well as to succeed. So this is part of why it's so darn scary to us as parents, right? We fear that any failure could have sort of large, long-term, even catastrophic consequences. It's the proverbial elephant in the room is in the school here. That is true sometimes, but I promise you that if you prop your kids up artificially and send them out into the wider world, the failure will find them eventually. And you want them to be strong and, prepared and equipped rather than, a little bit fragile and sort of looking strong on the outside, but maybe not all that equipped. So how do you do it? Lots of conversations are important. Here's one of the easiest tools, I think. Dr. Seuss was a genius and has managed to, kind of in rhyme form, normalize both sort of votes of confidence and optimism along with normalizing failure. So, your child, this is often a high school graduation gift, this book. It's perfect for any age of the child that you have, I promise. If you do have older kids, I would encourage you, if you haven't ever read this Theodore Roosevelt speech, sometimes called the Man in the Arena or the Daring Greatly speech, there's a lot of good conversation starters in this speech when it comes to failure. In particular, the whole point to the speech is that the glory is in the doing. It's in the effort, not in the outcome. Research validates that message, conclusively, so that's really important. And I also love the beginning part of it, where it actually sort of talks about the fact that, there's always going to be critics. It's not that, don't worry about the critics, because again, in today's age of social media and sort of constant awareness from other people, there are always critics. Sometimes they're like a Greek chorus of anonymous critics out there, and sometimes they're like, people right in front of you. Either way, it's difficult. And so I think it's really important to address that piece of it too with our kids. So, and there are many other things you can do as far as failure, I should say. Biographies, particularly athletes, scientists, inventors, are almost always written. Of course, there's a lot of failure built into those successes. And so those are usually written with an end of that in mind. There are some great movies out there. Younger kids, Meet the Robinsons has a wonderful message about failure. And, there's a lot of other ideas too, a lot of books and movies geared toward it. But, look for them, and when you hear them, even our, kind of old saws like, if at first you don't succeed, try again, you can use those and discuss those. They kind of last for a reason. All right, other things, the research in psychology, it's pretty interesting that it doesn't necessarily matter how you kind of operationally define happiness and success, whether it's very concrete and, measurable or a little bit more self-report type of thing. Characteristics like these bubble up time and time again. And so when you're thinking about how to strengthen and equip your kids, to sort of give them sort of the ability to withstand stress and, to manage, these are good things to encourage. These are very helpful. Self-control in particular is tricky in today's day and age because technology has gotten so darn good at taking away a lot of the waiting and the delay of gratification. And, the frustration underlies a lot of stress much of the time. And so, kids need to learn how to be frustrated, to tolerate frustration, and to manage it just like they do stress and anxiety. All right, here is, a surefire way to reduce stress. It's seemingly very small, and yet the research shows it's pretty profound. That when we focus our attention on things that we are thankful for, noticing, appreciating, positives, we feel better. So that is, again, it's not going to solve all your problems, but it's going to make, it's going to have a little elevation in mood. It's going to, to some degree increase happiness. And so it's a super easy thing just to build into your conversations and, into your life. Okay, independence. I am really passionate about talking to parents about building independence because it's so hard to do as a parent. Most of the time we're sort of not even recognizing where we're, kind of a little bit behind the step, myself included. I have a whole hour on that, so I'm giving you the 60-second version tonight. But, in a nutshell, you want to continue gradually and consistently to give your kids new freedoms and to link those freedoms with responsibility. And to, as they become more capable, you keep feeding that competence by giving them more and more independence. You've got to let them own it, though. If they have a job to do or something that they're responsible for owning, I'm not saying you can't ever get involved or help out, but you can't habitually sort of share in it and have them have the benefits of being independent. So we have to get off the field of play and over onto the sidelines. One of the things we really, again, are trying to do is work out of a job. We want to equip our kids with all of the skills that they need. We don't want to micromanage them. I know you really don't, right? I mean, by the time they get into high school, you're tired, right? It's hard to keep micromanaging. So this works better for everyone, I promise. This is again, like a lovely little nutshell to keep in mind, because I think it keeps us on the right path in terms of, we want to equip our kids for whatever comes their way, rather than trying to sort of clear out all of the challenge and obstacle and, discomfort. And particularly when we're thinking about anxiety, that's part of it. We don't want to eliminate the uncertainty and, all of the stressful situations in life. We want to strengthen them to know what to do with it. All right, I said in the beginning I'm passionate about downtime, and I am, because it's so well validated as important, and particularly when it comes to reducing stress. Online is such a hot topic. It is a daily challenge in most families, if not all. The research is nascent but compelling, and showing that time spent online does seem to be linked to increased depression and even suicide risk, particularly where social media is involved with vulnerable kids. The recommendation sort of right now, and I don't expect that it's going to change dramatically upward, is less than 2 hours a day is preferable. This is really hard, right? Because so much of their academic lives are online now. And, one of the biggest things that happens if kids feel some stress and anxiety around school and their homework, and yet they're on a computer or some device to do it, and it's difficult, they want to avoid whatever makes them feel anxious, and so it's so easy to get distracted and sidetracked when you're supposed to be doing your homework. And as parents, it's sometimes hard to know exactly what they're even on and doing. So being able to set limits on their usage is so difficult, but it's worth, I think, trying to do. All right, so another sort of very big picture thing that can be helpful is just thinking about, what do you care the most about? What sort of overarching messages about sort of healthy, balanced lifestyles do you want to give to your kids? It's easy in today's world to kind of focus on our kids' successes, on their performance, because that's what all the attention is on, not from us as parents necessarily, but it's being fed to us over and over again. But our job as parents, the part that isn't necessarily being fed to us, is to try to balance and prioritize the psychological well-being too. So I don't know I actually grabbed this slide off of the internet. I don't have any idea if that's a real research study or not. I just picked it because I thought it was kind of illustrative in the different ways it sort of conceptualizes success. And there's no right answer here, and that's part of what makes people interesting and great, is that we can have many different ideas. So it can be, success can have to do with your relationships, it can have to do with traveling, can have to do with what you have achieved in money or curing cancer in this case, or it can have to do with how you feel, if you've lived your life without regrets. So just something to think about, and make sure, again, as parents, you have the unique kind of opportunity as well as responsibility to shape your own kids. So you can use that. Again, with this long view, it is so easy. We all get caught up in the day-to-day. And when you're, kind of in that foxhole, if you were, that's really what's most relevant, right? And it's difficult to look beyond it. And, particularly when we're feeling afraid, when we're feeling, I hear so much from parents about them feeling guilty for sort of past mistakes made. I mean, we all make mistakes. That comes with the job. And so if we're going to get too hung up as parents on, kind of lamenting or beating ourselves up, it can really get in the way of us being able to be as effective as we want to be. And so we just really need to recognize kind of that relationship between our own fear and guilt and, stress and anxiety. I encourage you to, if you haven't recently, talk to some parents of 20-somethings or even 30-somethings, because it is amazing, even though, kind of when they're in these K through 12 years, the day-to-day, like I said, it can feel so all-consuming, and it is very important, but yet you step out, past, certainly when you step out past college, if they go to college, and they get into the working world, all of a sudden everything that came kind of before it tends to fade away in importance very quickly, or at least reduce in importance. But even think about this school year, right? Think about the first quarter, for example. There were surely some times of incredible high stress in some of your households over a particular test or writing assignment or project or what it may be, that, once it passes and it's over, you kind of look back and say, wow, did I need to spend so much time, energy, emotion? Perspective is very hard to find, but it is available if we seek it out, and it can be so helpful where stress and anxiety are concerned. So I think it's really important, again, that we as adults and as parents balance for our kids, give them an accurate perspective of sort of what it's like to kind of quote unquote, get into adulthood successfully. Because kids routinely give the feedback that we adults make it look very easy. We make it look like we always knew what we were going to do, and we had a plan, and we went where we thought we were going to go, and we did what we wanted to do, and we had it all together. And we know that's not true, right? We all have had, curveballs thrown our way. Often those curveballs have been some of the best things to ever happen to us. But, even when we're trying sincerely to portray some of that to our kids, our brains work against us. We have these cognitive biases, like the hindsight bias, where we actually sort of remember things to be more certain after the fact than they were in the present moment. So it is very difficult to accurately portray to our kids how much uncertainty there was, and yet it is so helpful if we can. Again, anxiety has to do with the difficulty tolerating uncertainty. So I encourage you to sort of try to channel, sort of some of your missteps or change in plans or, successful failures, if you will, and to share them. The ski slope is there because there's more than one way down the mountain, and the straightest line is often not the best one, nor does anyone really take it. Okay, so just to leave you with this quote I love by Ralph Waldo Emerson that's almost illegible, so let me read it to you. It says, "What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us." So, digest that for a moment, because that's a lot of complex thought to, communicate down to especially our younger kids. But I think it's a good guiding principle for us as parents as well. This idea that what matters most is sort of what characteristics, qualities, kind of what package we have to take with us, sort of what suitcase we're packing to go out into the world matters so much more than sort of where we've been or where we're going, because that's what's going to, kind of determine how things turn out for us. You've heard that phrase, right? Things turn out for the best for, people that expect the best for how things turn out. So we want to make sure that we are, thinking in those terms, and that again can really help reduce some of these things that in the moment cause tremendous stress and anxiety. So that is it for me. Thank you all again for coming and being so patient listening to me.